The security guard's hand touched Avery Mitchell's shoulder with deliberate force, his fingers pressing into the fabric of her charcoal blazer as if she were already a criminal. "Ma'am, you need to step back from the VIP area." The words hung in the air of Whitmore Trust's marble lobby like smoke from a fire that hadn't yet been noticed. Avery turned slowly, her dark eyes meeting the guard's with a stillness that made him shift his weight. She didn't pull away from his grip. She didn't raise her voice. She simply looked at him with the kind of quiet that precedes thunder. Around them, the pristine banking hall continued its morning ritual. Leather shoes clicked against imported stone. Whispered conversations about market fluctuations and portfolio adjustments floated between the towering columns. The scent of expensive cologne mingled with the sterile perfume of money and privilege. But something had shifted. The atmosphere carried the electric charge of a storm gathering strength, and Avery Mitchell stood at its center, her presence both unassuming and undeniable. The security guard's hand remained on her shoulder, unaware that he was touching the woman who held the power to reshape everything around them. In her simple leather handbag, an unsigned contract waited. $900 million in investment capital, ready to flow into Whitmore Trust's expansion plans. 900 million reasons why the next 20 minutes would become the most expensive mistake in the bank's 90-year history. Avery had entered Whitmore Trust at exactly 9:15 a.m., her arrival as punctual as every other aspect of her carefully orchestrated life. The morning light streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows caught the subtle sheen of her navy dress, elegant but understated, professional but not ostentatious. Her jewelry was minimal: small pearl earrings, a simple watch, a wedding band that caught the light as she adjusted the strap of her leather briefcase. She moved through the banking hall with the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to boardrooms and billion-dollar decisions, yet her appearance suggested nothing more extraordinary than a mid-level professional with an appointment. This was by design. Avery Mitchell had learned long ago that true power often wore the most humble disguise. The VIP banking section occupied the eastern wing of the lobby, separated from the general banking area by a low marble partition and an unspoken understanding about who belonged where. Behind the mahogany reception desk, Sarah Henderson looked up from her computer screen as Avery approached. The assessment was immediate and automatic, a visual calculation that took in skin color, clothing price points, and social markers in the space of 3 seconds. "Can I help you?" Sarah's tone carried the professional courtesy required by corporate policy, but underneath lay something else. A coolness that suggested help was not something she expected to provide. Avery smiled, the expression warm but not submissive. "Good morning. I'm here for the 9:30 meeting with Mr. Morrison, Avery Mitchell." Sarah's manicured fingers paused over her keyboard. She glanced at her appointment calendar, then back at Avery with barely concealed skepticism. "Mitchell Investment Group?" "That's correct." The pause stretched longer than necessary. Sarah's eyes moved from Avery's face to her clothing, lingering on details that would have been irrelevant for any other client. "May I see some identification?" Behind Sarah, 2 other VIP banking representatives, both white, both male, handled their clients with the ease of assumed belonging. James Whitmore IV was being offered coffee and pastries while discussing his trust fund modifications. Margaret Pemberton received updates on her foreign currency exchanges with warm smiles and casual conversation about her recent trip to the Hamptons. Avery reached into her purse and produced her driver's license with practiced patience. She had been through variations of this routine before: the extra verification, the skeptical glances, the subtle ways that doors opened more slowly for people who looked like her. Sarah examined the ID with exaggerated thoroughness, comparing the photo to Avery's face as if fraud were a reasonable assumption. "And you said this meeting was with Mr. Morrison directly?" "Yes, regarding the expansion financing proposal. Sarah's expression suggested she found this information difficult to believe. She picked up her phone and dialed an extension, her voice dropping to a whisper as she spoke to someone on the other end. Avery caught fragments. Says she has an appointment. Mitchell, I don't know, she seems… While she waited, Avery observed the subtle choreography of discrimination unfolding around her. The security guard had positioned himself within her peripheral vision, not close enough to seem threatening, but near enough to send a message. Other clients moved freely through the VIP area, but Avery found herself subtly contained to the reception area, as if invisible barriers had been constructed around her presence. The morning light continued to stream through the windows, illuminating the scene with crystalline clarity. Every gesture, every glance, every carefully modulated tone was being catalogued by a woman whose business was built on reading people and situations with surgical precision. Sarah ended her call and looked up with an expression of polite regret. I'm afraid Mr. Morrison's schedule is quite full this morning. Perhaps we could reschedule you with one of our associate bankers. It was a test disguised as an offer, a way of determining whether Avery Mitchell was someone important enough to insist on the meeting she claimed to have, or merely another person who could be redirected to a less prestigious appointment. Avery's smile never wavered. I think there may be some confusion. This meeting has been confirmed for 3 weeks. Perhaps you could check again. The confusion, as Sarah called it, began to crystallize into something more deliberate. She made another phone call, this one longer, and conducted with her hand cupped around the receiver, as if state secrets were being discussed rather than a simple appointment verification. Marcus Rivera, the security guard who had first approached Avery, now stationed himself at a discreet distance near the marble pillar that anchored the VIP section. His presence had shifted from casual patrol to focused observation. His eyes tracked Avery's movements with the attention usually reserved for suspected shoplifters or individuals who had triggered some internal alarm system. "Ma'am," Sarah said after ending her second call, "I'm having trouble locating your appointment in our system. Could you provide some additional verification? Perhaps a confirmation email or contact information for your assistant?" The request was reasonable on its surface, but Avery recognized it as part of a pattern she had encountered in countless variations throughout her career. The extra steps, the additional hurdles, the assumption that error was more likely than intent. She reached for her phone with the same measured patience she had shown her identification. As she scrolled through her emails, Avery became aware of the attention her presence was drawing from other areas of the banking floor. Conversations had grown quieter, but glances had become more frequent. The lobby's acoustic design, intended to create an atmosphere of hushed confidentiality, now seemed to amplify the tension surrounding her interaction with Sarah. "Here's the confirmation email," Avery said, turning her phone screen toward Sarah. "Sent from Mr. Morrison's office 3 weeks ago." Sarah squinted at the screen, her expression suggesting that emails, like identification documents, might be subject to sophisticated forgery. "I'll need to verify this with his assistant directly. Could you have a seat in our waiting area while I sort this out?" The waiting area, Sarah indicated, was not the comfortable seating arrangement adjacent to the VIP desks, where other clients conducted their business in plush leather chairs. Instead, it was a more Spartan section near the lobby's entrance. Functional seating that suggested temporary accommodation rather than welcome. "I prefer to stand, thank you." It was Avery's first small act of resistance, delivered with the same professional courtesy that had characterized all her interactions so far. But something in her tone suggested that patience, while considerable, was not infinite. Marcus shifted his position, moving closer to the reception desk. His radio crackled softly, and he spoke into it in the coded language that security personnel use to communicate about potential situations without alarming nearby civilians. Other VIP clients had begun to take notice of the extended conversation at Sarah's desk. James Whitmore IV paused in his discussion of trust fund modifications to glance over with mild curiosity. Margaret Pemberton looked up from her foreign currency paperwork with the expression of someone witnessing a mildly interesting disruption to her routine. Sarah made a third phone call, this one to Morrison's office directly. Her conversation was brief and conducted in the kind of hushed tones that suggested either conspiracy or embarrassment. When she hung up, her expression had hardened into something approaching official resolve. "Ma'am, I'm afraid Mr. Morrison's assistant has no record of this meeting. Our policy requires that all VIP appointments be confirmed through proper channels. Without that confirmation, I cannot provide you access to our executive banking services." The words were delivered with the finality of policy, but underneath them lay the satisfaction of someone who had successfully identified and neutralized a potential problem. Sarah's posture straightened slightly, as if she had just performed a small but important service for the institution she represented. Avery stood motionless for a moment, her dark eyes fixed on Sarah's face with an intensity that made the younger woman shift uncomfortably in her chair. When she spoke, her voice carried the same measured tone she had maintained throughout the interaction, but something deeper had entered it, a quality that suggested depths that had not yet been tested. "I see. And what would you suggest I do about the $900 million investment proposal that Mr. Morrison and I have been discussing for the past month?" The number hung in the air like a challenge, but Sarah's expression suggested she had heard similar claims before. In her experience, people who actually controlled nine-figure investments did not arrive for meetings in simple business attire, nor did they submit to extended verification procedures with such apparent composure. "Ma'am," Sarah said, her voice taking on the patient tone typically reserved for individuals experiencing delusions of grandeur, "I understand you may have significant financial interests to discuss, but our VIP services are reserved for clients who meet specific qualification thresholds. Perhaps one of our personal banking representatives could better assist you with your needs." The suggestion was delivered as a kindness, but it carried the unmistakable message that Avery had been evaluated and found wanting. Around the VIP area, other clients had returned to their conversations, but their attention remained partially focused on the unfolding scene, like theater patrons watching a subplot develop during intermission. Marcus took a step closer, his position now clearly supportive of Sarah's assessment. His presence suggested that if polite redirection failed, other options remained available. "I'm afraid that won't be sufficient," Avery replied. "This meeting concerns a major expansion financing arrangement that requires executive approval. I specifically need to speak with Mr. Morrison." Sarah's patience, already strained, began to show visible cracks. "Ma'am, I've checked our systems thoroughly. There is no record of any appointment, and frankly, clients of Mr. Morrison's caliber typically arrive with different arrangements." The pause before different arrangements carried weight. It encompassed cars and drivers, entourages and assistants, the visible trappings of wealth that Sarah understood as legitimate markers of importance. Avery's arrival, alone, modestly dressed, carrying her own briefcase, failed to match the template of power that Sarah recognized. "Different arrangements," Avery repeated softly. "Could you elaborate on what those typically include?" The question was asked with genuine curiosity, but something in Avery's tone made Sarah hesitate. For the first time since the interaction began, she seemed to sense that she might be navigating more treacherous waters than she had initially assumed. "Well," Sarah began, then paused. "Our high-net-worth clients usually, they have certain expectations about service levels and presentation. Presentation. Yes, they understand that Whitmore Trust maintains certain standards, and they fit naturally into our institutional culture." It was the closest Sarah had come to articulating the real basis for her skepticism, and the words seemed to surprise her with their boldness. She glanced around the VIP area, as if seeking confirmation that her assessment was shared by others. James Whitmore IV had stopped pretending to focus on his paperwork and was now openly observing the conversation. Margaret Pemberton wore the expression of someone watching a social boundary being tested in real time. Avery reached into her briefcase and withdrew a slim leather portfolio. From it she extracted a business card, which she placed on Sarah's desk with deliberate precision. "Perhaps this will help clarify my institutional culture," she said. Sarah picked up the card and read it with the same skepticism she had applied to everything else Avery had presented. The card was elegant but understated. Heavy stock, simple typography, minimal design. It read, "Avery Mitchell, Chief Executive Officer, Mitchell Investment Group." "Anyone can print business cards," Sarah said, though her voice carried less certainty than her words suggested. It was then that Avery made her first call. She withdrew her phone and dialed a number, her movements deliberate and unhurried. When the call connected, she spoke clearly enough for Sarah to hear every word. "Jessica, it's Avery. I'm at Whitmore Trust for the Morrison meeting, but there seems to be some confusion about the appointment. Could you resend the confirmation materials to their VIP desk?" She paused, listening. "Yes, the 900 million arrangement. Thank you." As she ended the call, Avery's eyes met Sarah's with an expression that was neither challenging nor submissive, but something more complex. The look of someone who had been tested and found the test itself wanting. "Those materials should arrive in your system momentarily," Avery said. "While we wait, perhaps you could explain why certain clients require different verification procedures than others. I'm curious about the specific criteria Whitmore Trust uses to determine who belongs in your institutional culture." The question was asked with the tone of genuine academic interest, but it carried implications that made everyone within hearing distance suddenly uncomfortable. The VIP area, which had buzzed with the comfortable sounds of privileged business, fell into a silence that seemed to expand beyond the marble partition into the larger banking hall. Sarah's computer chimed with an incoming email, and she turned to her screen with visible relief. The message from Jessica Chen, executive assistant to Avery Mitchell, contained detailed meeting confirmations, financial projections, and legal documentation that painted a picture significantly different from Sarah's assumptions. As she read, her face underwent a subtle transformation, skepticism giving way to uncertainty edging toward concern. But institutional momentum is a powerful force, and Sarah had committed herself to a particular interpretation of the situation. Rather than acknowledge her error, she doubled down on her original assessment. "These documents could be fabricated," she said, though her voice lacked its earlier conviction. "We've had instances of sophisticated fraud attempts before. Marcus, could you please call Mr. Bradley down? I think we need additional verification protocols." Marcus spoke into his radio again, and within minutes, Regional Director Tom Bradley emerged from the executive elevator. Bradley was a man who wore authority like an expensive suit, perfectly tailored, unmistakably present, and designed to impress. He surveyed the scene with the practiced eye of someone accustomed to resolving problems through the application of institutional weight. "What seems to be the issue here?" Bradley asked, his tone suggesting that issues, by definition, were temporary disruptions to be efficiently managed. Sarah launched into an explanation that painted Avery as a persistent individual making unreasonable demands without proper credentials. As she spoke, Bradley's attention shifted between Sarah's account and his own assessment of the woman at the center of the disturbance. Avery Mitchell stood with the kind of stillness that suggested complete comfort with being observed and evaluated. Her posture was relaxed but alert, like someone accustomed to boardroom negotiations where the stakes were measured in hundreds of millions of dollars. There was something about her presence that didn't quite fit Sarah's narrative of fraudulent desperation. "Ma'am," Bradley said, addressing Avery directly, I understand you're claiming to have a significant business relationship with our institution. I'm not claiming anything, Avery replied. I'm stating facts that can be independently verified. The question is whether Whitmore Trust is interested in those facts or has already decided they're inconvenient. Bradley's eyebrows rose slightly. In his experience, people engaging in fraud or delusion typically responded to authority with either excessive deference or aggressive defensiveness. Avery Mitchell's response suggested neither. Instead, she spoke with the measured confidence of someone accustomed to being taken seriously by people in positions of power. Our verification procedures exist to protect both the bank and our clients, Bradley explained. I'm sure you can understand the need for appropriate security measures. Absolutely, Avery agreed. Security is essential. What I'm trying to understand is why your security measures seem to vary based on factors other than actual security risks. The observation hung in the air like a challenge. Around them, the VIP area had taken on the atmosphere of a courtroom where an unexpected line of questioning had shifted the dynamics of the case. Margaret Pemberton, who had been pretending to focus on her currency exchanges, finally abandoned the pretense and turned to watch the conversation directly. James Whitmore IV had set aside his trust fund documents entirely and was observing with the fascination of someone witnessing social theatre. Other clients throughout the banking hall had begun to notice the extended drama unfolding in the VIP section. Conversations grew quieter as attention focused on the unusual scene of a black woman calmly holding her ground against the combined authority of Whitmore Trust's security and management staff. Bradley made a decision that would prove more costly than any he had made in his 15-year career with the bank. Instead of investigating Avery's claims more thoroughly, he chose to support his staff's initial assessment. Ma'am, without proper verification through our established channels, I'm afraid we cannot accommodate your request for executive-level meetings. If you have legitimate business with Whitmore Trust, I encourage you to schedule an appointment through appropriate protocols. And what would those appropriate protocols involve? Avery asked. Initial consultation with our client services team, financial verification through our standard procedures, and appropriate documentation of your institution's banking history. Each requirement was delivered as if it were perfectly reasonable, but the cumulative effect was clear. Avery Mitchell would be subjected to a level of scrutiny that other clients had not faced. The message was unmistakable. She would need to prove her worthiness in ways that were not required of others. Avery nodded thoughtfully, as if considering Bradley's explanation with academic interest. I see. And how long do those protocols typically take? For a case of this complexity, probably 6 to 8 weeks. 6 to 8 weeks, Avery repeated. She glanced at her watch, a simple piece that might have cost $50 or $5,000, its value impossible to determine from appearance alone. Unfortunately, that timeline doesn't align with our investment schedule. We're making final decisions on our East Coast expansion financing this week. She paused, allowing the implication to settle. Perhaps I should contact our other potential partners and let them know they'll have less competition for our business than we originally anticipated. It was the first hint that Avery Mitchell might represent something more significant than her appearance suggested, but Bradley had already committed to his course of action. The institutional machinery of doubt and verification had been set in motion, and stopping it would require acknowledging that it had been unnecessary in the first place. I understand your disappointment, Bradley said, but our procedures exist for important reasons. I'm confident that once you've completed the appropriate steps, we'll be able to provide you with excellent service. The conversation had reached an impasse, but Avery showed no signs of frustration or defeat. Instead, she seemed to be studying the situation with the detached interest of a scientist observing an experiment. She made another phone call, this one brief and cryptic. Jessica, please prepare alternative arrangements for the Chicago expansion. Yes, I understand the timeline implications. Thank you. As she ended the call, something changed in the atmosphere of the VIP area. The other clients, who had been observing with mild interest, began to sense that they might be witnessing something more significant than a simple customer service dispute. Margaret Pemberton leaned closer to her banker, whispering questions about the identity of the woman at the center of the commotion. James Whitmore the Buff abandoned all pretense of conducting business and focused entirely on the unfolding drama. But it was Sarah Henderson who first noticed the most troubling development. Her computer screen showed a steady stream of notifications, LinkedIn alerts indicating that someone named Avery Mitchell was being mentioned in posts by various financial industry professionals. The notifications were multiplying rapidly, suggesting that word of something was spreading through professional networks with viral intensity. "Mr. Bradley," Sarah said, her voice tight with new concern, "I think we might have a problem." The problem manifested first as a sound, the distinctive ringtone of an executive phone line cutting through the hushed atmosphere of the VIP banking area. Tom Bradley's personal cell phone, the one reserved for urgent communications from senior management, began vibrating against the marble reception desk where he had placed it. The caller ID showed a name that made Bradley's stomach contract. Morrison, CEO. He answered with the careful tone of a man who suddenly suspected he might be standing at the center of a catastrophe he had failed to recognize. "Mr. Morrison, good morning." The voice on the other end was sharp with urgency and barely controlled panic. "Bradley, what the hell is happening down there? I've got board members calling me about some incident with Mitchell Investment Group. Please tell me you haven't done anything incredibly stupid." Bradley's eyes found Avery Mitchell, who stood 10 feet away with the same composed expression she had maintained throughout the entire encounter. She was watching him with the detached interest of someone observing a situation that had already played out exactly as she had anticipated. "Sir, we have a situation with someone claiming to represent Mitchell Investment Group, but she doesn't have proper verification. Morrison's voice rose to a level that could be heard by everyone in the VIP area. "Bradley, please tell me you're not talking about a black woman in her 40s who's probably wearing business attire and carrying herself like she owns the place." The description was so precise that Bradley felt the first real stab of fear. "Yes, sir, but our verification procedures don't apply to the CEO of our largest potential partner, you absolute fool. Get her whatever she needs and get her up to my office immediately. And Bradley, start praying she's in a forgiving mood." The line went dead, leaving Bradley staring at his phone as if it might provide some guidance for navigating the disaster that had just engulfed his career. The elevator doors at the far end of the banking hall opened with a soft chime, and CEO Robert Morrison emerged at a pace that suggested controlled panic. He was a man in his early 60s, with the silver hair and confident bearing that came from 3 decades of managing institutional wealth. But as he crossed the marble floor toward the VIP area, his expression carried the unmistakable signs of someone attempting to manage a crisis that could define his legacy. Morrison's eyes locked onto Avery Mitchell the moment he cleared the marble partition, and his face underwent a transformation that was visible from across the banking hall. Relief, mortification, and desperate hope cycled across his features in rapid succession. "Ms. Mitchell," he said, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent VIP area. "I cannot begin to express how mortified I am. There has been a catastrophic breakdown in our communication systems. It was a diplomatic fiction designed to provide face-saving cover for everyone involved, but Avery's expression suggested she was not interested in accepting convenient explanations. "Has there?" she asked. "Because from my perspective, your communication systems worked exactly as designed. They just communicated things you might not have intended." Morrison approached with the careful steps of a man walking through a minefield. Behind him, the entire banking hall had gone silent. Conversations had stopped mid-sentence as the drama that had been building for 45 minutes reached its climax. "Ms. Mitchell, I've been looking forward to our meeting for weeks. the expansion proposal you've presented represents exactly the kind of forward-thinking partnership that Whitmore Trust was founded to facilitate." He gestured toward the elevator with the desperate courtesy of a man trying to salvage a relationship worth $900 million. "Perhaps we could continue our discussion in my office." But Avery Mitchell made no move toward the elevator. Instead, she turned to address Tom Bradley directly. "Mr. Bradley, you mentioned that your verification procedures exist to protect both the bank and your clients. I'm curious, what exactly were you protecting your other clients from when you subjected me to those procedures?" Bradley's mouth opened and closed without producing sound. Around him, the VIP area had taken on the atmosphere of a courtroom where the verdict was being delivered. "And Ms. Henderson," Avery continued, turning to Sarah, "you mentioned that clients of Mr. Morrison's caliber typically arrive with different arrangements. I'd like you to explain what made you confident that I didn't fit that caliber." Sarah's face had gone pale, but she remained silent. The answer to Avery's question hung in the air, unspoken but perfectly clear to everyone present. Margaret Pemberton had stopped pretending to conduct business and was watching with the horrified fascination of someone witnessing a public execution. James Whitmore IV was recording the scene on his phone, apparently recognizing that he was witnessing something that would be discussed in Chicago's financial circles for years to come. Morrison stepped forward, his voice carrying the authority of his position, but also the desperation of his situation. "Ms. Mitchell, please, let's address this privately. I'm certain we can resolve any misunderstandings and move forward with our partnership." Avery finally moved, but not toward the elevator. Instead, she walked to Sarah's desk and placed both hands on the marble surface, leaning forward slightly in a gesture that commanded absolute attention. "Mr. Morrison," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the silent banking hall, "I don't think you understand the nature of the misunderstanding here. Your staff didn't fail to recognize me. They recognized exactly who I am, a black woman in a business suit, and responded accordingly." The words hit the VIP area like a physical force. Several clients shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others found sudden interest in paperwork that had held no appeal moments earlier. "The question now," Avery continued, "is whether Whitmore Trust believes that response represents the institutional culture you want to maintain, or whether you're ready to demonstrate that it represents values you're prepared to change." She straightened and turned to face Morrison directly. "Because, Mr. Morrison, the $900 million I came here to discuss today isn't just about financing your expansion. It's about investing in institutions that align with our values, and right now, I'm not certain about that alignment." The silence that followed Avery's declaration stretched across the banking hall like ice forming over deep water. Morrison stood frozen, his executive training warring with his desperate need to salvage a partnership that represented more than just money. It represented validation of Whitmore Trust's position as a premier financial institution. The first crack in the institutional facade came from an unexpected source. James Whitmore IV, whose family name graced the bank's letterhead, stepped forward from his position near the trust services desk. "Excuse me," he said, his voice carrying the authority of generational wealth and institutional ownership. "But I think I need to understand what I just witnessed here." His attention fixed on Tom Bradley with the intensity of a board member who had suddenly realized he might need to explain a PR disaster to other shareholders. "Mr. Bradley, you subjected Ms. Mitchell to verification procedures that you did not apply to me, despite the fact that my appointment today was scheduled for the same time slot through the same systems." Bradley opened his mouth to respond, but Whitmore cut him off with a gesture. "I arrived 15 minutes late, without identification, and asked to modify appointment details that weren't in your system. Yet I was immediately accommodated with apologies for any inconvenience." The comparison hung in the air like testimony in a trial that no one had realized was taking place. Margaret Pemberton, who had been watching the proceedings with growing discomfort, began gathering her papers with the hurried movements of someone planning an immediate departure. Morrison made a decision that would be studied in crisis management courses for years to come. Instead of attempting damage control or offering private resolution, he chose public accountability. "Ms. Henderson," he said, his voice carrying the weight of institutional authority. "You're terminated, effective immediately. Please surrender your access credentials to security and collect your personal belongings under escort." Sarah's face went white. "Mr. Morrison, I was following standard procedures." "No." Morrison cut her off. "You were following prejudices disguised as procedures. There's a difference, and that difference just cost us our reputation and potentially our largest partnership." He turned to Tom Bradley, whose face had taken on the grey pallor of a man watching his career disintegrate in real time. "Mr. Bradley, you're suspended pending a full review of today's incident. We'll be conducting a comprehensive audit of our client service protocols, with particular attention to any disparities in treatment based on client demographics." Marcus Rivera, the security guard who had been positioned to remove Avery from the premises, now stood motionless near the marble pillar, his radio silent, his purpose fundamentally altered by the revelation of who he had been prepared to escort from the building. But Morrison wasn't finished. He pulled out his phone and, with the deliberate movements of a man making a point, placed a call that would be heard throughout the banking hall. "Legal Department, this is Morrison. I need you to prepare a formal apology statement regarding discriminatory treatment of a major client. Yes, a major client. Have it ready for release within the hour, and make sure it includes specific commitments about staff retraining and policy review." As he ended the call, Morrison turned to address the entire VIP area, his voice pitched to carry to every client and employee within earshot. "Ladies and gentlemen, what you witnessed today represents a failure of institutional values that I take full responsibility for addressing. Whitmore Trust was founded on principles of excellence and respect for all clients, and today we fell short of those principles." Margaret Pemberton paused in her hurried packing, apparently realizing that leaving immediately might be interpreted as an endorsement of the discriminatory behavior she had silently witnessed. James Whitmore Dufour was no longer recording the scene, but was instead taking notes, apparently planning to bring the incident to the attention of the full board. Other clients throughout the banking hall had stopped pretending to conduct business and were openly watching the institutional reckoning taking place in the VIP area. The scene had the quality of a moment when private prejudices became public accountability. Uncomfortable, but necessary. Sarah Henderson was escorted from the building by security, her departure witnessed by the same clients who had seen her subject Avery to extended verification procedures. The symbolism was unmistakable. Actions had consequences, and those consequences were applied with the same public visibility as the original discrimination. Tom Bradley's suspension was announced to the VIP staff, ensuring that Avery's treatment would not be forgotten or minimized by those who might be tempted to dismiss it as a simple misunderstanding. The message was clear: institutional discrimination was not a misunderstanding, but a choice, and choices carried responsibility. As the immediate consequences unfolded around her, Avery Mitchell stood with the same composed demeanor she had maintained throughout the entire encounter. She had not demanded these actions. She had simply forced the institution to confront its own behavior and make choices about the values it wanted to represent. The banking hall buzzed with quiet conversations as clients processed what they had witnessed. Some appeared uncomfortable with the public nature of the reckoning. Others seemed relieved that behavior they had found troubling was being addressed directly rather than politely ignored. Morrison approached Avery again, but this time his manner was different. Instead of desperate damage control, he showed the careful respect of a man who had learned an expensive lesson about assumptions and institutional culture. "Miss Mitchell," he said, "I hope these actions demonstrate our commitment to ensuring that what happened today never happens again. But I understand if you need time to reconsider our partnership. Avery Mitchell took a moment to survey the transformed landscape of the Whitmore Trust VIP area. The marble and mahogany remained unchanged, but something fundamental had shifted in the institutional atmosphere. The comfortable assumptions that had governed interactions moments earlier had been replaced by a new awareness of how power operated and who was affected by its application. "Mr. Morrison," she said finally, "what happened today wasn't an aberration. It was a revelation. Your staff didn't suddenly develop discriminatory attitudes this morning. They revealed attitudes that were already part of your institutional culture." She gestured toward the banking hall, where clients and employees continued to process the dramatic confrontation they had witnessed. "The question isn't whether you can prevent this specific incident from happening again. The question is whether you're committed to addressing the underlying assumptions that made it possible." Morrison nodded with the careful attention of a man who understood that his next words might determine whether Whitmore Trust maintained its reputation as a premier financial institution or became a cautionary tale about institutional prejudice in the modern era. "We are committed," he said. "But I recognize that commitment means more than words. It means structural changes, accountability measures, and ongoing vigilance about the ways unconscious bias affects our service delivery." Avery walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a view of Chicago's financial district, where other institutions faced similar challenges with varying degrees of awareness and commitment. The morning light that had illuminated her arrival now cast different shadows across the banking hall, as if the entire space had been rearranged by the morning's events. "The $900 million we discussed represents more than financing for your expansion," she said. "It represents a choice about the kind of business partnerships we want to build. Mitchell Investment Group evaluates potential partners based on their operational excellence, but also on their commitment to creating environments where talent and capability are recognized regardless of the package they arrive in." She turned back to Morrison, her expression thoughtful rather than confrontational. "Today, you demonstrated that Whitmore Trust is capable of recognizing and addressing institutional failures. That's encouraging. But sustainable change requires more than crisis response. It requires proactive commitment to creating systems that prevent these situations from arising in the first place." James Whitmore IV had been listening with the attention of someone who recognized that family legacy and institutional reputation had been placed at risk by attitudes he had never directly confronted. He stepped forward with the deliberate movements of a man accepting responsibility for problems he had not created, but had perhaps allowed to persist through inaction. "Ms. Mitchell," he said, "as a member of the founding family, I want to assure you that what happened today does not represent the values on which this institution was built. But I also recognize that good intentions are insufficient if they don't translate into consistent practice." Avery nodded acknowledgement of his statement, but her attention remained focused on Morrison. "The partnership we've been discussing would involve significant integration between our organizations. Our staff would be working closely with yours, our clients would be served by your systems, and our reputation would be linked to your performance." She paused to let the implications settle. "If we move forward, it won't be despite what happened today. It will be because of how you respond to what happened today. The incident revealed problems, but your response demonstrates whether those problems are priorities for resolution or simply inconveniences to be managed." Morrison straightened slightly, as if accepting a challenge that would define not just this partnership, but the institutional culture he would leave as his legacy. "Ms. Mitchell, I propose that we structure our partnership agreement to include specific commitments about diversity training, bias elimination protocols, and regular assessment of service delivery equity. That's exactly the kind of structural commitment that interests us," Avery replied. "Because creating change requires more than good intentions. It requires systems that make good intentions sustainable and accountable." The banking hall had gradually returned to something approaching normal operations, but the morning's events had left an indelible mark on everyone who witnessed them. Clients spoke in hushed tones about what they had seen. Employees processed new awareness about institutional expectations, and management began the complex work of translating crisis response into sustainable reform. Margaret Pemberton, who had initially supported the discriminatory treatment Avery received, now approached with the uncertain steps of someone who had recognized her own role in perpetuating systems she had never consciously examined. "Ms. Mitchell," she said quietly, "I owe you an apology. My reaction earlier was inappropriate, and I'm grateful for the education about institutional bias that your experience has provided." It was a small moment of personal accountability within the larger institutional reckoning, but Avery received it with the same gracious professionalism she had maintained throughout the morning's challenges. "Thank you, Ms. Pemberton. Change happens one interaction at a time, and recognition is the first step toward creating better interactions in the future." As Avery Mitchell prepared to leave Whitmore Trust, the institution she had entered as a supplicant for service, but was now departing as a catalyst for transformation, she paused at the marble reception desk that had been the site of the morning's initial confrontation. The contrast was remarkable. Where Sarah Henderson had once sat in judgment of Avery's worthiness, now stood a temporary replacement who had been briefed on the morning's events and instructed to treat every client with the respect that should have been standard practice all along. "Mr. Morrison," Avery said, "I want to leave you with a thought that might be useful as you implement the changes we've discussed." Morrison leaned forward with the attention of a man who understood that every word from this point forward would be scrutinized for its wisdom and relevance to institutional reform. "The assumptions your staff made about me today, about my capabilities, my resources, my worthiness for respect, those assumptions cost you 45 minutes, 2 employees, and nearly cost you $900 million in partnership investment." She gestured toward the banking hall, where the morning's drama was already becoming part of institutional law. "But more importantly, those assumptions revealed something about the environment you've created here. They showed how unconscious bias operates in systems that believe they're operating fairly." James Whitmore IV, who had been listening with the intensity of someone planning to carry this conversation back to a board of directors, asked the question that everyone present was thinking. "Ms. Mitchell, what would you recommend for institutions that want to prevent these situations proactively?" Avery smiled, the first genuine expression of warmth she had shown since arriving at Whitmore Trust. "Start by acknowledging that bias isn't a problem other institutions have. It's a problem that exists wherever human beings make assumptions about other human beings based on limited information." She picked up her briefcase, the same simple leather case that had been present throughout the morning's transformation. "Then create systems that catch those assumptions before they become actions. Train your staff to recognize the difference between legitimate verification procedures and discriminatory barriers. Most importantly, create accountability measures that make bias expensive rather than convenient." Morrison nodded with the expression of a man converting crisis into curriculum. "And the $900 million partnership?" "We'll proceed as planned," Avery said, "with the additional oversight measures we discussed. Because Mitchell Investment Group doesn't just invest in financial potential, we invest in institutional integrity." As she walked toward the banking hall's main entrance, Avery's footsteps on the marble floor created the same rhythmic sound that had announced her arrival 3 hours earlier. But now those footsteps carried different weight. They marked the departure of someone who had transformed not just her own situation, but the institutional culture she was leaving behind. At the door, she turned for one final observation. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the banking hall, "remember that respect isn't something people earn by proving their worthiness. Respect is something people deserve by virtue of their humanity. The verification procedures come after the respect, not before it." She paused, allowing the message to settle among clients and employees who would carry this lesson into their own interactions beyond Whitmore Trust's walls. And for those who might be wondering whether someone like me belongs in spaces like this, the answer is that spaces like this belong to all of us. The only question is whether institutions recognize that reality proactively or learn it the expensive way. With that final observation, delivered with the gentle authority of someone who had just demonstrated the power of quiet dignity over institutional prejudice, Avery Mitchell walked out of Whitmore Trust and into the Chicago morning, leaving behind an institution forever changed by her presence. The banking hall remained silent for several moments after her departure, as if the building itself was processing the transformation that had just occurred within its marble walls. Then, gradually, conversations resumed. But they were different conversations, informed by new awareness and shaped by the recognition that assumptions, once revealed, could never again operate with the same unconscious power. Morrison stood at the windows, watching Avery's figure disappear into the flow of Chicago's financial district, and reflected on the morning that had redefined his understanding of institutional leadership. In his pocket, his phone buzzed with messages from board members, media contacts, and other CEO colleagues who had already heard about the morning's events through the networks that connected the city's financial community. The story would spread, as such stories do, becoming part of the larger conversation about bias, power, and institutional change that defined the modern business landscape. But unlike many such stories, this one would be remembered not just for the problem it revealed, but for the accountability it demanded and the transformation it produced. Because sometimes the most powerful changes begin with the quietest voices insisting on the loudest truths, and sometimes the cost of discrimination becomes so clear that institutions have no choice but to choose justice. Not because it's easy, but because it's right, and because the alternatives have become too expensive to sustain,